Hello and welcome to a video tutorial session. The purpose of this video tutorial session is to provide you with a brief summary around some poetic devices, the common poetic devices that you will likely encounter in the poems that you select. So what we are going to be doing is hopefully developing on your prior knowledge. You should have a fairly good understanding around what the poetic devices are. But I also want you to take one step further. So when you are appraising a poem, you are analyzing a poem and deciding that is this the poem that you'd like to select for your assignment, I want you to take a look at the devices that are used and then see how the devices are used to create or convey some kind of a feeling or message. So it's very important for you to appraise the poem as a whole to get a sense of what is this poet saying, what is the intention of the poem, and then to see how the poetic devices actually contribute towards that overall message that the poet is intending to make. So I'm going to be modeling this process, and my hope is that you take the skills that you will develop in this very brief session and you apply it in your own selection of poems. This is just a reminder once again that the experience of poetry and the interpretation thereof is extremely subjective, but it can sometimes be incorrect. And where it's incorrect is if you incorrectly interpret poetic devices. So it's very important that you start the basic building blocks are understanding these poetic devices and then looking at them in the context of a poem. So we are going to be doing that in the session. I will be asking you some questions, encouraging you to reflect on specific things. I'm also going to require you to read some poems out loud. So please embrace this as much as possible. I'm going to be reading through some poems too. Some of you might want to skip through that part, but I think it's really nice to have the performance element of a poem. I think a lot of the times why poetry is not enjoyed or sometimes hated by students is because the performance of the poem is missing. You don't get the opportunity to listen to the musical rhythmic nature of a poem. The beauty of language is not heard, it's just seen because you are reading it silently. So I'd like to encourage you to get people to read these poems for you, divide into groups, do what you will. But yeah, just mostly enjoy it and enjoy diving into these poems. The important poetic terminology and features that we are going to be focusing on is going to be rhythm, rhyme, alliteration, assonance, and memory cues. These are just some basic poetic devices and features that you are likely to encounter. And I want you to keep coming back to this idea of how do each one of these devices and features work together in the poem? How do each of these features complement one another? And how do they work together to tell some sort of a story or convey some kind of emotional theme? As much as you are going to be looking at individual features, we're going to be looking at these features individually. I also want you to look at it interdependently. How do they connect together? How does it fit in the poem as a whole? So I shall be modeling this somewhat in this session, and I really want you to take the skills that we're going to develop and apply them when you are interpreting poems in your course reader, or you are reading through poems and deciding whether this would be an appropriate poem to select for your assignments. That will hopefully be a poem that you will use one day in your teaching practice classrooms, or one day when you are actually a teacher and you have your own class to see to. So to kickstart our activity and reflection, I want you to think back to this poem. I think we did go through it in class, but I want you to identify the primary poetic devices in the poem. And I want you to reflect on how it transforms the meaning, feeling, or emotion of the poem. Coming back to this whole idea of the simple question that we always need to ask ourselves when we encounter a poem: does this poem make us feel happy, or does this poem make us feel sad? And when you read through the poem, I think you will quickly establish that this poem makes you feel happy. But I want you to think of why. Consider the poetic devices that are used. I've highlighted specific parts of the lines of the poem, and I want you to think about how does this transform the meaning and feeling of the poem, and how does this link back to the emotion or tone. So for instance, with line 2, it says here, the ice cubes cackled in their glass. It's interesting that Hendricks decides to use this word of cackling, meaning laughter, but to use the word cackling rather than laughing has a different undertone or meaning. So I want you to think about the word choice that the poet uses and why she might have chosen this particular word. Look at it in context and make certain notes about this. So the first poetic device that we're going to be looking at is the rhythm of a poem. A rhythm is the musical beat. I like to think of it as the heartbeat of the poem. And in order to appreciate this musical quality of the language and how it sounds to the ear, you have to read the poem out loud. And in the listening, you will pick up a sort of internal beat in the poem. This beat is made up of patterns of sounds and how some syllables or elements or words, there is emphasis or stress, and other syllables are unstressed. This then creates the musical beat. And this fun, bouncy tone that we see in this particular nursery rhyme is the heart of the poem. It creates the pleasure. The pleasure is a pleasure of sound, of hearing the musical nature of language. And when you are thinking and appraising the rhythm of a particular poem, I really want you to think about how the poet has structured the words, how the poet has chosen specific syllables and specific sounds, and why the poet has chosen those sounds, and how this changes the feeling and emotion of the poem. So with this particular nursery rhyme, it goes as such. Handy Spandy, Jack-a-dandy, loves plum cake and sugar candy. He bought some in the grocer's shop, and out he came, hop, hop, hop. So we see the stressed and unstressed syllables. There is the rhyme scheme that creates a beat to the poem. In order to appreciate this particular nursery rhyme, we need to be able to appreciate and hear this rhythm and musical beat. So please, when you are reading out poems out loud, I want you to listen to the beat, to the musical nature of the poem. So rhyme and rhythm, I want you to see them as being connecting features of a poem. And there are many different rhyme schemes that exist. But it's very important for us to use letters to track the rhythmical pattern or the rhyme pattern so we can appraise the poem as a whole. So for instance, I've used a limerick here because it's got a fixed rhyme scheme, and we see that the rhyme scheme goes A, B, B, A. A is tracking words that sound the same, and B are a second set of words that sound the same as well. This creates a specific rhyme scheme. And because this is a limerick, it is a fixed rhyme scheme. All limericks have these particular rhyme patterns, and it follows this formula. However, in another poem, it's very important for you to look at, okay, well, which words rhyme? And then to think back to, how does this rhyme scheme contribute to the rhythm or beat of the poem? A lot of the times it's very important for you to listen to the poem and for you to also identify this rhyme scheme with the use of letters. So I want you to do this and scribble down notes on the poems. This is the most important thing when you are interpreting and praising a poem, that you actually make notes and you see the connection and you see how a specific pattern emerges. It's a very conscious activity, and it's an activity where you really are digging deep. The next poetic devices we're going to be looking at is the use of alliteration and assonance. So I'm sure we all know by now, alliteration is the repetition of a consonant sound in a line or a verse, and assonance is the repetition of the vowel sound in a line or verse. How I always like to remember alliteration is, in the word alliteration there is the double L, so we already see a sort of consonant sound here in a sense. Okay, but coming back to the point that we've already made, we are not just identifying alliteration, we are looking at how it creates it adds to the musical beat of the poem, and in order to truly appreciate alliteration and what it brings and adds to the poem, we need to obviously read it out loud. I feel like I'm saying this a lot, but I'm hoping that this drives home this idea that we really need to listen to poems out loud. So to dive into alliteration and how it creates a kind of sing-song nature in a poem, and how it creates a kind of song device and it adds to the rhythm and rhyme of a poem, I have this excerpt of On the Ning Nang Nong by Spike Milligan. You might remember this particular poem when we looked at nonsense poetry. So I'm going to read it out loud, and I want you to identify the features and devices of alliteration, and I want you to think, is there perhaps something more, other kind of sound devices and poetic devices that are being used? So it goes, on the ning nang nong, where the cows go bong and the monkeys all say boo. So immediately I'm hoping that we are thinking, oh, there's definitely a sound pattern here, and that's where alliteration and assonance add a deeper dimension to the poem. It adds a sound element, and you kind of have to read it out loud to truly appreciate it. So I'm hoping that we are seeing in that first line, I have highlighted the N's. There is a repetition of the consonant N, and this creates a specific beat. But what we are also seeing is that there's the repetition of the NG sound in ning, nang, and nong. And then on the next line, line 2, in bong as well. This is explained as a phonetic agreement. It is a sound agreement. It is the same sound that is repeated. And this can also then be considered as alliteration. But I hope we are appreciating and noticing how this creates a deeper element to the poem. It is a sound, and I'm hoping that we are thinking it is a fun and loud and vibrant tone that this brings to the poem. Okay, there is also another device or feature in this particular excerpt that I have, but when we read through the poem together, in the next few slides, I'm sure it will become more evident then. But just for now, I want you to think, what else is here? And particularly, I'm looking at the word boo. What do we think this line, the line 3, and the monkeys all say boo? What kind of poetic device do we find here, and how does it kind of link to this nonsense, vibrant nature of the poem? I want you to take a few seconds to think about it, jot down some notes. In the previous slide, I'm sure you would have picked up the use of assonance in on the ning, nang, nong. And what is really interesting is assonance is littered throughout the poem, and there is really this short, punchy feel to it. It really creates this bouncy, energetic feeling, which links perfectly to the nonsense element of the poem. We know that nonsense poetry is very playful, and it plays around with sound devices, and it plays around with language. However, vowel sounds can be used to create very different tempos and moods in specific poems. And I have two examples that we are looking at here. We either have a short vowel sound or a long vowel sound, and each of the sounds will create a different set of feelings and emotions. And this basically affects us on a semi-conscious and sometimes for children on an unconscious level. When it's short vowel sounds that are sometimes quite bouncy or flowy, it creates a kind of joyful feeling. However, when the vowel sounds are longer, it forces the pace to be slowed down. And with this slower tempo, it creates a more somber tone and feeling. And sometimes the somber tone and feeling forces us to pause, and perhaps an image emerges in the mind's eye, or sometimes it forces us to pause and consider a thought or idea. It's very important for you to always, once again, look at how these devices are used in context. So coming to the first example that I have attached here, we see that the vowel sounds are used to create this sort of flowy, constant sound. It goes, "O wind a blowing all day long, O wind that sings so loud a song." And the use of the O and all the other vowel sounds that we see here in these two lines really creates this constant flow. And in this constant flow, we really get a sense of the wind that's blowing constantly. Later on in the slide, you will have the entire poem, and when you read through it, I want you to think about how does the sound device, the use of assonance, how does this kind of mimic this constant blow of the blowing of wind? There's definitely this swooshing, whooping feeling of the wind, and as I'm even describing it, I'm using kind of onomatopoeia here because the sound devices are evident and are there, but you have to once again read it out loud. However, a very different tone emerges in the second excerpt that I have. It goes, "And in the stream the long-leaved flowers weep, and from the craggy ledge the poppy hangs in sleep." Immediately, there is a very different tempo of the mood. The mood is tempered down, the tempo is slowed down. And this really creates a somber kind of feeling. We get a sense that this space in nature is immediately in our mind's eye. I'm thinking it's shaded, it's not in the sun, it's very isolated. There is this feeling of sadness that is attached to this, and that is because the pace is slowed down. So it's very important that when you identify the vowel sounds, you look at how does this impact the mood, speed, and vitality of the poem. Is it joyful? Is it suspenseful? Is it somber and sad? Only you can answer those questions, but I encourage you to read it out loud and identify how does the use of this device link back to the tone, feeling, and message of the poem. The next device that we're going to be discussing is the use of memory cues, or alternatively the use of repetition. You will find that in many children's poems, this is a crucial device. It's easier for the child to read through the poem, of course, when there are lines that are repeated, but there is something about repetition that is comforting and soothing, and it creates a sense of unity in the structure of a poem. So even with this, think about how when you are singing a song, we are always more confident in singing in the chorus because it is a repetition. There is something about when we know something is coming up that we feel a sense of expectancy and we feel a sense of comfort because we know the words and we can participate in them. So when you're looking at the repetition and this use of memory cues, it can be littered throughout the poem. So often whole lines are repeated at different parts. And I want you to think about how does this change the rhythm and beat of the poem? Sometimes there might not be a fixed rhyme scheme, but if there is a repetitive line, it does create some kind of rhythmic beat to it, which is why every song has a chorus, because it adds to the rhythm and feeling and beat of the poem. It's very important that you consider the use of the repetition throughout the poems. A lot of poems are circular, meaning that there is a repetition in the beginning of the poem, at the end of the poem. The poem that we're going to be looking at, titled The Spell of Creation, really explores this circular structure in a very beautiful way. But I want you to also look at where does the repetition come in? Is there a sort of structure to it? And what does this structure add to the overall feeling and tone of the poem? I thought in this video tutorial session, I really had to read this poem out loud to truly appreciate the sleepy and dreamy tone of it. And I want you to think about how does the rhyme, rhythm, and memory cue serve to slow down this pace of the poem, and how this actually relates to this idea of slowing down how we live, slowing down the pace, and just enjoying the beauty of doing nothing, the beauty of sleeping, the beauty of relaxing. And I'm hoping that in this time of isolation and lockdown, at the very least, we are getting more sleep than we ever have. So hopefully this is something that you can really relate to. So it goes like this. When I wake up early in the morning, lift my head, I'm still yawning. When I'm in the middle of a dream, stay in bed, float upstream. Please don't wake me. No, don't shake me. Leave me where I am. I'm only sleeping. Everybody seems to think I'm lazy. I don't mind. I think they're crazy. Running everywhere at such a speed till they find there's no need. Please don't spoil my day. I'm on my way. And after all, I'm only sleeping. Keeping an eye on the world going by my window, taking my time, lying there and staring at the ceiling, waiting for that sleepy feeling. Please don't spoil my day. I'm miles away, and after all, I'm only sleeping. Keeping an eye on the world going by my window, taking my time when I wake up early in the morning, lift my head, I'm still yawning. When I'm in the middle of a dream, stay in bed, float upstream. Please don't wake me. No, don't shake me. Leave me where I am. I'm only sleeping. So this entire poem is made up of memory cues and repetition, and it has a very circular nature. So if you take a look at line 1 and line 27, you will see that the concepts, or what is being stated, is interchangeable. It starts with, within the flower there lies a seed, and then it ends with, like the seed within the flower. We see unity and connection here. There is a complete circle that has happened. And what's really interesting about this poem and where the beauty lies in is that it's stating something about creation, about nature, and this idea that everything is interconnected. It's a really beautiful message. And the other day we acknowledged it was Earth Day, and this particular poem would be beautiful for that kind of appreciation of Mother Earth. So consider how the repetition creates this kind of tone, creates this mood, and creates a deeper message around connection and interconnection, and how everything is linked together. So I'm kind of giving away the interpretation of the poem, but let that start you on your journey of interpretation. Read it out loud and look and see the pattern that emerges, and hear the pattern that emerges too. The next poetic device and feature we're going to be looking at is onomatopoeia. And this, of course, is the use of a word that imitates or elicits a sound when spoken. And children really gravitate towards this particular feature in a poem because it is very playful a lot of the times, and it really provides an opportunity to emphasize expression. So I have a very brief list of words that mimic sound below, and I want you to think, how can you add to it? And the next slide that we have, we're going to be diving into on the ning, nang, nong again, and I really want you to read it out loud and to identify the words that elicit a specific sound. So please take your time reading this out loud. And what I love so much about this particular poem is that it is just alive with sound, with emphasis, and it even ends on what a noisy place to belong. The sound elements and how you would perform this poem really brings forward this very playful nature of language. And I think that that's where the importance of nonsense poetry comes in. It encourages children to play around with words and to play around with sounds. And the words that they use are a way in which they interact with the world. So it's really important to play around with sounds, play around with sound devices and phonetic agreements. So read it out loud. And I want you to try identify, where does the sound, where is the onomatopoeia, where does that come to the fore in this poem? And I really want you to share your responses with one another and to build on one another's perception of this poem. So finally, another poetic device that we often will encounter in poems is the use of personification. So this is when human qualities are given to animals or objects. Essentially, this inanimate object is given human qualities. For this particular poem, and we have encountered the poem in class and we looked at it, but what we see, poems are being defined as learners in school. They are attending school. And I want you to think about, what is the implicit message in there? What is being implied by this? If a poem is like a human being, what idea or thought do we take away from that? And when you reread this poem, that's in your course readers as well, I want you to think of the two different poems. So because of the different teaching approaches, the two poems have a very different day in school. The one poem experience is very didactic, where the poem's being pulled apart by the teacher, and we see that the classroom is very teacher focused. Whereas the other approach, we really see that the poem is sitting down with the children. It's as if the poem and children learning together. They are in the same learning environment. They're learning from one another. And I want you to kind of take away, well, what is the message of this? Why did Michael Rosen create this? What is his intention? And in actual fact, I believe that the message in this poem is actually intended for teachers and encouraging them to rethink how they teach poetry. So when you are reading through it, I want you to think of this key feature of personification and how it actually is linked directly to the message of the poem. There's two very different experiences from the poems in their day at school, and what do they learn at the end of the day? Okay, go to the poem, write some notes around this, and we will dive a little bit deeper into it. So the next thing that I'd like you to focus on with our poetic devices is the pattern of sound. I want you to consider what contributes to the rhythmical pattern in a particular poem. Okay, so what's interesting about this poem is that it can be interpreted in different ways. The title of the poem is Dreams. So Langston Hughes keeps it quite open-ended, the title, and depending on how we interpret that title, do we see dreams as positive ambitions or goals, or do we see dreams or as perhaps daydreams, and that they might actually not be realistic and they might not align to reality? Depending on how we interpret this title of the poem will actually affect how we view the poem as a whole. So I'd like you to look at the various imagery and devices that are used, and I want you to think about, are there different ways that you can interpret or understand the meaning and intention of this poem? Think of at least 2 or 3 and look at it through the different lenses, and then decide which one you think is more aligned to what you believe or what you view in the poem. So make this meaningful, and what I'm trying to get you to do here is to look at how all of the elements add together. And I think a lot of the times when we are quite confused about how to interpret a poem, always start with the title. The title normally is your first kind of road sign or indication of what the poem might be about. But what's interesting here is Langston Hughes has left it very open-ended, and depending on how we conceptualize and define dreams will actually affect and impact the perception that we have on this poem as a whole. So I want you to do this activity, and I'd like you to share your responses with one another. So I have already begun with the introduction to this poem titled The Wind by Robert Louis Stevenson. I'd like you to pay attention to the sounds and images that the words themselves evoke, and how the use of assonance actually contributes to the poem as a whole. Very important that you read it out loud and you identify with the various devices and features that are used. Also, very interestingly, in this poem, there is a narrative voice. I want you to consider, how does this narrative voice link to the sound devices? If you can define this narrator, who is this narrator? And how do all the elements add to the entire message and feeling of the poem? Always consider everything together and how each of the devices complement one another. Make notes on this. You can find the poem, of course, in your course readers, but scribble ideas, take down notes, make it personally relevant. Apply the knowledge that you have already developed. This poem, titled What Someone Said When He Was Spanked on the Day Before His Birthday, is not a poem that is in your course reader, but I thought I would add it because I really just love the way that the narrative voice is used and poetic devices that are used to really capture this innocent voice of a child. And I think for many of us, we can relate to this whole idea that when parents did something, you just wanted to run away from home because there was the sense of, I am sick of here and I'm going to go find my happiness outside. But the reality is that because a child is obviously very innocent and powerless, these plans never materialize to anything. And that's really where the joy of this poem comes in. I think that this is also one poem, unlike Langston Hughes's Dreams, which the title was obviously very open-ended. This title is very closed-ended. It tells us exactly why this child is deciding that he wants to run away from home. And it's also really interesting because the entire title is in caps, really to emphasize that this is very serious. It's a very serious matter. But as we read through the poem, the tone is extremely playful. So the poem goes, someday I may pack my bag and run away. Someday I may, but not today. Some night I might slip away in the moonlight. I might, some night, but not tonight. Some night, someday I might, I may, but right now I think I'll stay. And I think with this, the joy comes in is that children always feel emotions very strongly at a particular point in time. They can have this tantrum, these meltdowns, and then the next minute it's all back to normal and they're laughing and playing again. And I think really that's where the joy in this poem comes through. And once again, I think it kind of reminds us of our inner child, and maybe we are laughing back to experiences that we've had in our childhood about wanting to run away because we just thought adventure was waiting and we would be happier out of home. We know actually that home is the best place to be. So in conclusion, it's very important for you to be able to identify various poetic devices and for you to be able to discuss the impact on the devices to the poem as a whole. It's very important that you use this when you are selecting your poems. Look out for interesting devices that are used and really make it personally relevant. Choose poems that really utilize these devices in interesting and intriguing ways. It's also a very good idea that when you are practicing your analysis skills to apply this to the poems in your course reader. In a very real sense, the course reader is our own anthology of poems and should be used as a guide for the types of poems that we are likely looking for. Mostly, I hope that you enjoy interacting and engaging with poems and that you are now more open-minded to the process. Keep well and keep safe, and happy poetry reading.